Join me as we discuss a grim world of perilous adventure, and I talk about the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game and how it influenced future editions of Dungeons & Dragons, today on Daddy Roll the One. Please help support Daddy Roll the One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today, I'm going to be talking about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. A few people in the comments have asked me to cover this, and so I wanted to talk about it because it was something that I was really interested in when it first came out, mainly as a resource to use for planning my own campaign, which I was still running into sort of a hybrid of first and second edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I thought it would be interesting for folks to hear a little bit more about how this game came to be, and really kind of, I think, interesting how it ended up influencing the future direction of Dungeons & Dragons all the way up into the 5th edition, which is the one that's currently for sale as of August of 2024. I know that the Player's Handbook for the new whatever edition we're calling it, 5.5 or 6, or some people are just calling it 1 D&D or the 2024 D&D, whatever that is. It goes out for sale officially next month in September. But even that one does have ties to the 5th edition, which does have ties all the way back to this from 1987. I think it was, or 86. But first off, we need to talk a little bit about the history of the company that published this and how this game came to be. So the first thing that we want to do is talk about a game called Reaper. So this is a miniatures skirmish game, war game. It accommodates 2 players with armies controlling up to around 30 figures. If you want to go that high, it kind of starts to break down at that point. But it has a few rules for figures on a 1-to-1 scale. And this game was developed in 1978, originally by 2 gentlemen, Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell. And they were childhood friends from England, and they had worked together to develop this game for miniatures fighting fantasy battles. And they couldn't find a publisher. They ended up creating their own company by the very evocative name of Tabletop Games. And they were still looking for a way to get this thing distributed, like for people to sell it. And so they eventually connected with a gentleman by the name of Brian Ansell. And Brian worked for a company called Asgard Miniatures. And so he ended up connecting Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley with the folks from a company called or shop, really is what it was, the Nottingham Model Soldier Shop. And that shop agreed to sell the Reaper game. And so then Richard and Rick ended up working on making some new games. They were always pushing forward and trying to develop new things. And so the next game that they developed was called Combat 3000. It was a science fiction miniatures war game, but it relied on using miniatures from Brian Ansell's Asgard Miniatures company. So they were using what were called the Space Marines from that particular company. And so then eventually Brian Ansell's going to leave Asgard, and he gets connected with the folks at Games Workshop, who end up connecting him or helping him set up a new miniatures company called Citadel Miniatures. So Brian Ansell's running Citadel Miniatures, and he ends up hiring Richard Halliwell to help him with that. Richard Halliwell is, in addition to being a game designer, was also really into designing models for the miniature figures that they were making. So while they're there at Citadel Miniatures, it's, connected with Games Workshop. Brian Ansell and Richard Halliwell end up making yet another game called Imperial Commander, which is another science fiction game. Here's where, this isn't the first place the story starts to kind of take shape, because all of this is really influential in how we get to the game of Warhammer. But Imperial Commander has a setting attached to it, and the setting involves these like cosmic forces that are in this like ongoing battle back and forth, these vast titanic struggles between these cosmic forces. And that idea was really intriguing to them, having these forces that were behind the actions that were taking place for the setting of the game. Okay, so then Ansel wants to create a miniature game to help, he wants some rules that are going to help him to sell these Citadel miniatures that he's making. And so they came up with yet another game. This time it was a fantasy campaign that they set on a sort of fictional continent that at the time they called Lustria. Okay, and they pulled in this idea from Imperial Commander of this like age-old, ongoing, never-ending war between these like two opposing cosmic forces. Okay. And so that game was developed, and then Rick Priestley enters the picture again, and he works with another person by the name of Tony Ackland. I'm going to get into him a little bit later, but Rick Priestley and Tony Ackland end up developing this game that takes place on this continent of Lustria, and they add more to it. And eventually that's going to become a game known by the name of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Okay, so the first edition of that game is published in 1983, and it's published by Games Workshop. Now, in between there was a second edition of the game Reaper that had been then published in 1981, and it was published by Games Workshop. So you see this kind of connective tissue going from the original Reaper first edition to Reaper second edition at Games Workshop, and then 2 years later to Warhammer Fantasy Battle at also at Games Workshop 1983. Now, just to quickly back up and talk about Games Workshop, I have talked about them before. I have a video covering the Fiend Folio monster book for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons first edition that was published in 1981, and originally was supposed to be published in 1979, but it doesn't get published until 1981. So I have a whole video about that. And in that video, I talk about the early formation of Games Workshop, and then also how it had ties to TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. But the super short version is that there's three gentlemen, John Peake, Ian Livingstone, and Steve Jackson. And as I said in that video, there are two very famous Steve Jacksons within the world of role-playing game design or strategy game designs, board game design. And one of them is here in America, Steve Jackson behind Metagaming and Steve Jackson Games. And then there's a Steve Jackson in England who is behind one of the founders of Games Workshop. So I'm talking about obviously the English one because we're talking about Games Workshop. So they start out in 1975 and they're producing a lot of different things. But one of the main things that John Peake liked to do was create very elaborate and very cool custom wooden board game or game boards behind to be used with games like, say, backgammon or Mancala, things like that. So he was really into that, but they're also into other types of games as well. And they end up getting connected with the folks at TSR through a series of circumstances that involves a newsletter that they're publishing called Alan Weasel that Brian Bloom eventually sees. And he contacts them because he sees that they have this sort of distribution in place already in England and connects them to be the official distributors of Dungeons and Dragons in England. So that is the short version. You're going to want to see the Fiend Folio video to get a little bit more if you want more detail on that. Okay, but they've started this company and they were distributing other games as well. So over time, they get this distribution deal with TSR, but then they also start distributing games like Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest and Traveller and Middle-earth Role-Playing or MERP. And so eventually TSR is going to back off from them and do their own thing. They open a UK division for reasons. Okay, so that's kind of like what happened there. But for a while, they had Games Workshop had connections to TSR. So when they stopped producing and distributing Dungeons and Dragons Retreat, because that's the other thing that they were doing, they created a deal with TSR where they would print, not just distribute, but print Dungeons and Dragons related products in the UK, because it was cheaper than printing them in the US and then shipping them to England to have them then be distributed. But when that deal goes away, now you have Games Workshop wanting to kind of do some more things, do some new things. So this is where we start to get into the development of something like Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Now, that particular game, again, comes out in 1983, and it is it's sort of like a two-part game. Kind of. The vast majority of the game is focused on miniatures, large-scale miniatures battles, fantasy armies battling each other on a tabletop with miniatures figures. So the war game rules take up the bulk of this. And then there is a section, however, in the back where it talks about how you can create characters and do role-playing style adventures within the rules framework that was developed to run the fantasy miniatures games. So let's pause for a second. We're going to go take a look on my laptop, and we're going to check out some of the rules of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So the first thing that you notice, this is a box set, and there's this just very striking cover art by an artist of the name John Blanche. Now, this was the first image or anything that I had ever seen of this game. I saw it, it was an ad, as I recall, in Dragon Magazine, and it was black and white, but just the style of art was so different. It's so violent, and it's dark, and I mean this warrior's got like these weird creepy face things on his like knee guards and like on his shield, and he's just used this hammer to like smash the jawbone off of this like skeleton warrior. And then you see all these other like skeletons and weird things in the background. And while the background's not really all that detailed, it's not a full color, fully detailed painting like you would see on a TSR book at the time. The subject matter and the way that it's handled in this, again, was just so, not alarming is not the right word, but I was really drawn in. I loved this style of art. Now, John Blanche is a very famous British fantasy and science fiction artist. And, he got into art. And what's really interesting was that he was really good at doing sort of these fantasy style, like warrior type characters. He just kind of became attracted to doing that kind of thing. He liked doing it. And one of the things that happened was that when he went to art school, my understanding is that they told him that, like, yeah, you're good at doing this, but you're never going to get paid. You're never going to be able to make money off of drawing dragons and elves and fantasy warriors and that kind of stuff, which is really interesting because that is where he ends up making his money. So he does work as, like, for example, there was a book that came out in the 70s by David Day, and it was called the Tolkien Bestiary. And I remember checking that book out from the library all the time. In the 80s is when I first heard of it. And I had no idea that John Blanche had done some of the art, the interior art in that particular book. So good for him for making his way to being able to make a career doing this style of art, because he is extremely good at. So he's going to go on to work with Games Workshop for the majority of his career, doing a lot of illustrations for them for various products over time. All right, so then let's just jump in really quick, and we're going to look at, and this is going to be very, very brief. So because the intent of this is I'm going to focus my discussion today on the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, that book that I showed you at the very beginning. But again, I'm trying to show you how we got there. How did we get to that point where that book's going to be published? So, and we do need to talk about Warhammer, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game, which is a stretch. I mean, there's role-playing rules in here, but as you're going to see, they're pretty limited. So This originally was sold as a box set of 3 books. So the first book is for tabletop combat. The second book is for magic, but it's this third book that I want us to look at here, which is for characters. And so you see here the names of the authors. We already talked about Richard Halliwell and Richard Priestley and then Brian Ansell. We've talked about all 3 of them. And so here we see them on this book. And so essentially what this is going to do is talk about how to create individual characters as opposed to mass combat. Okay, so Tony Ackland, again, on this one, he's the artist for the interior illustrations. He's also going to be responsible for like 99% of the interior illustrations of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the rulebook. So, and that's kind of his thing. So from what I've been able to find, the majority of his career has also been in conjunction with Games Workshop. He's also a designer, so he's not just an artist, but he does a lot of art for most of their books, at least, very, very early on. So this is just talking about the introduction and that this is the idea of role-playing characters. And so that's what you're going to see in this particular book here is how to do that. And then, it just talks about the game master and the players and things like that, all the basic stuff. Then it talks about how to create a player character and that you have 3 types of characteristics: personal, fighting, and skills. And then those 3 combined are going to create a character's profile. And then it says your personal characteristics are things like social status, age, sex, intelligence, cool, willpower, and leadership. So these are all things that we're going to see later on when we get to the main fantasy role-playing book. And then the fighting characteristics, and it says their importance in combat have already been described in tabletop battles. So that was book 1 of this 3-book set, which are things like the number of attacks, number of wounds you can take, your initiative, your weapon skill and bow skill, your strength grade, your toughness, and your move. So that's how they break this thing out. And then it jumps right into like skills. So skills in this particular version of the game are things like trapper, tracker, trader, sailor, mate, navigator, captain. You can see some of these, they don't even tell you what it does. For example, the mate, navigator, and captain, you're just supposed to figure that out. One of your skills can be minstrel. I mean, the skills are kind of interesting here. I would use skills sort of loosely. But we're going to see those skills transformed into something a little bit bigger when we get to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. All right, so then you have your social status, and it goes through that, and the number of wounds you can take. And so it just says men, dwarves, and elves all start off with 1 wound to kill. So why do they only cover men, dwarves, and elves? Because those are the only playable characters that you can have in this particular game. Talks about your weapon skill. So most stuff in here is going to be based on rolling d6s, and which is interesting in this because the tabletop battles kind of expands the sort of dice that you're going to use a little bit more than this. So you have your toughness, your move, your skills. Again, we talked about that. Your age and your intelligence, your cool, which is described earlier, and we're going to deal with that in a second when we dive into the fantasy role play book in general. All right, but again, we're looking at these. I think these are pretty cool illustrations by Tony Ackland. So this is the 80s, so we're sort of out of that amateur style of art that was very, very prevalent in early tabletop role-playing games, and we've seen some of those here on the channel before, and we're getting to the point where there's an expectation on the consumer base that you're going to have a little bit more professional art, and we do get that in here. So one of the big draws, I think, of Warhammer, besides the setting, and we will talk about the setting later, is sort of just the overall style, the aesthetic. And I talked about that cover art by John Blanche, who interestingly also, I talked earlier about how Games Workshop was for a while distributing and then also printing their own versions of TSR's D&D books and other TSR games and then distributing them. Well, one of the things that they do end up printing over in the UK for Games Workshop is the 1977 Holmes Basic Edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which here in the United States had a cover by David Sutherland. But the folks at Games Workshop said that cover's not really gonna speak to our audience, and kind of they want something a little grittier and like a little for lack of a better word, darker or grimmer. And so they got permission from the folks at TSR to have John Blanche redo the cover art for the Holmes Basic set that is sold in the UK. So the interior of the book is exactly the same, but the cover art was changed, and you can see that here. All right, so then this goes over character advancement, and basically there's two types of characters you can be: wizards and fighters. Now, a wizard is just a fighter that also can cast spells. So really, the character options here are not all that robust. And this was one of the complaints that this system got. It really feels like it was tacked on. It was trying to maybe capitalize on the popularity of role-playing games, despite the fact that this is coming out of a wargame background from, first from Reaper and then, going to Warhammer. It's coming out of mass combat war games for miniatures. And then it very much feels like they thought that they needed to have this role playing aspect to it in order to attract that audience, because as we're getting into the 80s, we're starting to see that role playing games, the audience for those is growing by leaps and bounds. And we're conversely seeing that the growth for miniatures war games is, at least it's staying stagnant, if not falling, in favor of role-playing games. So there's some stuff in here. There's alignments, which is very interesting because they rate it on a 5-point scale of good, neutral, evil, avarice, which is just selfish, and then hunger, which is your basic unintelligent monster that's just out for food. All right. And then it goes through some more things. There's monsters. It talks about some injuries. And we start to see this. One of the things that people really like about Warhammer is the detailed critical hit tables. And you see the genesis of that here in this very short table. We're going to see this blown out much more when we go over the bigger book. Then it talks about creating adventures. Not much detail here. There's a little bit on the costs of how much equipment costs. There's encounter charts, and which are hardly detailed at all. And then there's these little tables here that you see for subterranean, woodlands, marshland, etc. Again, not detailed at all. And then there's this tiny little sort of like example scenario, which has hardly anything in it to help you run this, because there's just no detail in here, which is just how it was originally intended to be like. As sort of a very rules light system that puts most of the decisions in the hands of the game master. So this is all that initial adventure, and that's going to wrap that up. So I wanted you to see that so that you can see how we get from this very limited vision of a sort of sketch of what a role-playing game rules system might look like for Warhammer. And then we're going to see it blown out much more detailed when we get to that, fully illustrated and colored book that I was showing you just a second ago. I thought it might be interesting to look at what the folks at TSR, sort of a separate division, but they reviewed Warhammer, the Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing Game in Dragon Magazine number 85. And interestingly enough, the game created such a splash that it's actually reviewed by 2 different people in this magazine. And again, I think it will kind of help to provide context for sort of like what was going on in the gaming world at the time and how people were viewing this brand new, game that was coming out. So this first review is by Ken Rolston, and he is the main reviewer at Dragon Magazine and will continue to be so for quite a while. We're going to see his name pop up in a second as well, a few years later. But he writes this article called Advanced Hack and Slash: Combat Plays a Big Role in 4 Fantasy Games. So he's going to review not only Warhammer, the Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing Game, but he's also going to go all the way back and review Reaper. So he's going to review the one from 1981. Now, this magazine, Dragon number 85, this actually comes out in, I believe it was 1984. Yep, May of 84. So this game at this point is already 3 years old, and really it's even older than that because remember 1981 was the second edition. The first edition was published in 1978. Okay. And then he's also going to review a game called Lost Worlds, the fantasy combat book game. And then he's going to review Cry Havoc. Okay, so we're not going to talk about those, but just want to talk about briefly. He talks about, how, playing a violent style combat game and like why that might be fun. And he says, he prefers more like role playing stuff, but every once in a while he likes, you got to hear this, how he writes this thing. Deep in my heart, I harbor a longing for the visceral thrill of vicarious violence and the cerebral challenge of strategic and tactical maneuver. I love his alliteration with visceral, vicarious violence. I'm sure that was on purpose. I mean, it had to be, right? So then he goes on to just talk about, what games he's going to review. And there's been a small but dedicated group of fantasy miniatures gamers. Okay, so you have to remember, like when he says small but dedicated, original miniatures games were historical. So they were mostly Napoleonic. There were, all different time periods were covered, but Napoleonics was considered, I believe in the Secrets of Blackmore documentary, they refer to it as like the Cadillac of miniature war games. But there were medievals. Okay, so the people did do that. And then fantasy was a small subsection. And a lot of people that preferred fantasy would just go on to do role-playing games because they were sort of looked down on in the circles of people that wanted to play serious war gaming, American Civil War, like I said, Napoleonics or whatever, what have you. Okay, so he talks about Warhammer, the mass and combat fantasy role-playing game. And he says, though far from a perfect fantasy miniature system, it's a credible step in the right direction. It doesn't compare with serious ancient and medieval miniatures rules, nor does it handle the variety of magic spells and fantastic beasts encountered in most role-playing games. It is currently the most coherent blend of wargaming and fantasy role-playing available. As an introduction to the fantasy miniatures warfare, it is quite satisfactory. More experienced miniatures gamers may lament the lack of more detailed wargaming or magical rules, but they should admire the way that elements hang together, and they may find a few game mechanics worthy of inclusion in their own campaigns. So then he talks about the various different books, and what he says generally, I'm not going to read this whole review, is that the tabletop battles in volume 1. Generally, he likes them. He says they're kind of simple, but he likes the execution there, although he does lament the significant number of typos and other errors that he finds as he's reading through these. And that's something that we're going to see later from another reviewer as well. Talks a little bit about magic and kind of just says like, it's kind of just there, but it's fine. It has fine fantasy flavor. There's 4 levels of spells like that, but it's very quick. Look how much he writes about the tabletop battles versus what he writes about magic. And then he gets into the to volume 3, which is the role-playing rules that we just looked at. And he says it's unimpressive and cursory, somewhat less detailed than the original D&D game, which is saying quite a bit, actually. The introductory campaign adventure is a vague sketch, omitting aspects like the opponent's stats and tactics, NPC descriptions, and detailed floor plans. The tone of the scenario is suggested by a major NPC, a dragon named Thelma, which is not exactly high fantasy. So he calls it primitive. And he says, but that's not a commendation because there's a lot in here to like. It's just, it's not really intended to be a role-playing game, which we kind of talked about. And then it's just interesting to see what he says about Reaper, which is he basically says it's also primitive. That's the short version of his review here. The detailed criticism of the game design is inappropriate since many of the major weaknesses have been lessened or eliminated in the Warhammer design. So he does recognize it's the same designers, obviously, and he recognizes that Reaper is sort of the progenitor of Warhammer, of the Warhammer mass combat system. Okay, but so a lot of the mechanics in Warhammer, I'm just going to call it Warhammer Fantasy Battle as opposed to the mass combat system, because that's what we call the Warhammer Fantasy Battle, or you had Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But the mechanics of that really start here in Reaper, and then they just get expanded on, but the system doesn't change too awfully much from what was in Reaper. Okay, so that's that. Now, what's interesting, again, I mentioned this, you have an entirely other review here. Warhammer FRP system falls flat. And this is by an author of the name Catherine Kerr. She writes a ton of articles in Dragon over the years, and she's sort of known for being really digging into a subject. So I think, if I remember correctly, one of her her famous articles, and I hope I'm not misattributing it, but I think it was her, was one, it is essentially, the title is something like An Army Travels on Its Stomach. And it's basically all of the logistics that go into having to feed an army and supply them while they're traveling and on campaign. And so that's the level of detail that she was writing in Dragon Magazine. They're really interesting articles. I never really necessarily found a lot of use for them directly in the table, but I just found them very fascinating to read. So she's very well read, and she's a good writer as well. And so I always enjoyed reading those. But she basically really kind of hammers home that there's a lot of mistakes in this game. She could look at it's a sloppy, amateurish piece of work that needs rewriting, editing, and extending to be a playable system. And, then the text is dreadful, in case you hadn't figured that out. And then, interestingly, though, she comes to a lot of the same conclusions that Ken Ralston comes to, which is that the mass combat system is not bad. So she says the booklets contain 2 separate games with a weak attempt to link them together. The first, a set of rules for tabletop battles with miniature figures, is very good. The second, Pieces of a Fantasy Role-Playing Game, is embarrassingly bad. All right, and then she goes on to talk about what's pretty good about it as far as the rules for the mass combat. And then she said she'd rate it as excellent if it weren't for the numerous sloppy errors and the ever-present typos and the ambiguities in the text. So she's pretty thorough here with her dislike, I guess. Although, again, she does put credit where it's due and says that, the mass combat rules are pretty decent. And then she goes a little bit into the magic rules and say it's actually, she prefers it to the convoluted rationale such as forgetfulness in D&D and AD&D. You guys will see my video on that and why I actually do like that. And then she talks about some enchanted objects. And then the sloppiness is too mild a word when you get to the rules for character creation. And she says the rules are incomplete. There's only 2 character classes, as we just talked about, just 3 races. Race is supposed to be determined randomly. And then she says you use a series of die rolls to generate your characters that require many different probability spreads rather than being based on one underlying system. None of the characteristics are generated from or related to another. So that's a big complaint in this, that she says. So you could end up ruling a character who is physically weak, but who was really good at weapons, because the strength skill is completely separate from the weapons skill. And similarly, you could have a character who's not very bright but has a high magical ability, and she doesn't like that. And, that makes sense. I can see why she doesn't like that. And then she just goes on. There's no provision in the rules for basic adventuring skills like disarming traps, climbing walls, etc. She does talk about how the skills are rolled up when you generate the character, and they're randomly determined. There's only 22 listed, and it's possible to end up with a peculiar characters. And then she said, I rolled up an elven princess who had skills as a desert nomad. And then she says, when would an elf be in the desert? So she's definitely going for traditional fantasy, as opposed to, obviously in Dark Sun campaign, you have elves from the desert, right? And she says, and as a fisherman. So that is kind of confusing if you have an elven, desert warrior who's also a fisherman. Doesn't necessarily make sense. All right. And so then she just goes on, talks about the sketchy random encounter tables. You saw that. And then she says, is it worth buying? It depends on the potential purchaser. As an experienced referee who's discontented with the magic system and some other games, you might profit from the magic rules. But anyone who revels in gory combat to the exclusion of all else will enjoy the game. The novice gamer, or any gamer who's looking for a complete rule system should save his hard-earned cash. Perhaps someday the game will be revised to make it live up to its potential, but until then, it will be a curiosity and nothing more. Well, we are going to see it live up to its potential, because 3 years later, in 1986, we're going to have the release of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and we're going to dig into that next. Okay, I hope you liked that history about how we got from the, original Reaper game to the Warhammer Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing game to eventually getting to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And if that is something that you enjoy, I'd like to ask if you could please like this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so that you will be notified when I post new content. All right, so 1986, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, originally this was a hardcover book. I have a later printing. Mine is from 1989, and it's soft cover. I picked this up at Last Grenadier in Burbank. So if you're an old-timer who read Dragon Magazine back in the day or has just kind of been around for a little bit, you probably remember Last Grenadier because they advertised pretty frequently in Dragon Magazine. And that's actually how I first heard of them. And then when I moved to Southern California, I realized I didn't live that far. So that's where I picked this up. The store's unfortunately gone now. And so we see here the credits. So we talked about the game design before. So Richard Halliwell, Rick Priestley. So Graham Davis, Jim Bambra, and Phil Gallagher, all three worked on a variety of projects, not only for Games Workshop, but also for TSR. So very specifically, I remember Jim Bambra and Phil Gallagher worked on stuff for, I think it was B10, Knight's Terror, I think it was called, the module B10, O2, Blades of Vengeance. So they were pretty involved with that. And then Graham Davis worked on a variety of different things. He began playing D&D right almost immediately after it first made its way over to the UK. Wrote a ton of articles for different magazines, role-playing game magazines. He worked on Vampire the Masquerade, GURPS. He also wrote the Celts supplement for the Historical Resource Green Book for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, so those are some of the creators here. And then we talked about the art. Now, the cover artwork for this one is by John, I think it's pronounced Civic. And he's mainly known, interestingly enough, as being what's called a paleo artist. So he worked on a lot of art that is related to drawing prehistoric creatures. And that's kind of where his claim to fame kind of initially came from. Although he also has done, obviously, fantasy and science fiction art. So he does this cover here. Just get some close-up detail on that, and you can see. And again, right away, you can see that this is very different from the aesthetics, again, that were popular with Dungeons and Dragons back in the day. And even the subtitle where it says A Grim World of Perilous Adventure. And you see this is a pretty violent cover that you wouldn't see on a TSR product. Okay, so the book is sort of divided into a few main sections. So you have section 1, which is the player section, and it's pretty short, up to about 60 pages. Then you have the game master section, covers the next roughly little less than 60 pages. Then you have combat. And combat's pretty long. And then you have magic. And the magic section is also pretty detailed because there's a lot of, it covers all the spells and things like that. Then you have religion and belief, which is a huge part of this game, or at least the setting. Then you have the bestiary, and then you have the world guide, and then there's a short scenario. So the world of Warhammer is probably, more so than the mechanics, I would say, is the one thing, or at least it's a thing that people really, really enjoy about this setting. So it is a dark, grim setting that is sort of based on an analogous to sort of like Renaissance era Earth, and so a lot of people like that because it's very grounded. Like you can immediately get a sense of like what this country is supposed to be like because it has an equivalent of an Earth country or nation at that time. But, a lot of people don't like it because they think that it's like too, quote, realistic, and that it's not fantasy enough. And some people just don't like dark fantasy. They don't play these types of games to have that kind of, tension where, you're fighting these forces that, you kind of know ultimately that you're probably not going to win. Like your party of adventurers might succeed, but you kind of get the sense in going through this that most likely the forces of chaos are eventually going to succeed in essentially taking over the entire world. And it might be in a few years, or it might be in a few months, or it could be decades in the future. But you kind of get the sense that it's going to happen. And so that every little thing that you're doing is just kind of like maybe slowing it down, but you're not going to stop it. And some people like that. It's very Call of Cthulhu that way. And, but again, some people don't like that. They want to play a role-playing game to be, the heroes who win the day and save everything and everything's great, right? So it's a different kind of thing. And when you think about the kind of role-playing games that were out, fantasy role-playing games specifically that were out when this game came out, there was really nothing like this. So for fantasy, I mean, you had D&D, and then quickly thereafter you had Tunnels and Trolls, and then a few years after that you've got say RuneQuest, you've got Rollmaster, and then it's sort of like little baby cousin Middle Earth role-playing MERP. And there's others, right? But those were kind of like the main ones, and they all have very much like a despite the creators of D&D saying that it wasn't based on Tolkien, there is a bit of a Tolkien aesthetic to all of those role-playing games. And this one really kind of gets away from that. And so I've heard it described as sort of like a blend of Call of Cthulhu with D&D. And I think that, not setting-wise, not mechanics, but setting-wise, I think that makes sense. Now, the mechanics in this are, I don't really think the mechanics are the reason why people play this game. So it just gets into like, what's in this book? What is a role-playing game? The basic stuff that you would expect in a role-playing book like this. Talks about winning and losing, how to use dice, etc. Got some more art here. Remember, all of this is by Tony, and I just forgot his last name. Pardon me for that. Ackland. Okay. Now, some of the pieces are by other artists, but those are usually the color pieces, and they tell you that. All right. So the brief description of this game, it's percentile based. So the early parts of Warhammer Fantasy, like the battle, the mass combat game, they were 10-sided die based, but not percentile. So scores were like going from 1 to 10. This expands it for a little bit more granularity. So they're percentile based, and it's percentile roll under. That's basically the system. And then you have all these different scores. So you've got movement, weapon skill, which again is going to be a percentage. You've got ballistic skill. So this is the update from what you saw was like bow skill or whatever they called it in that initial version that we saw just a minute ago. Now it's called ballistic skill. And that's because this game ups the technology level to a little bit closer to like, say, 1500s. And so there are firearms in this game, and they're pretty widely available. They're not necessarily foolproof. In fact, they're more likely to be a detriment than a benefit, but they're there. Okay, so it changes it to ballistic skill to encompass more than just bows. Then you've got strength, toughness, wounds, initiative, attacks. Then you have dexterity, leadership. So most of these, again, are percentages. You can see it's even telling you it's based on a percentage. Intelligence. And then your cool. So that's your ability to remain calm and collected or even sane under severe psychological stress, which is a big part of this game. So again, very much like in line with Call of Cthulhu. And then you have willpower, which is the measure of mental and magical resistance to general magical awareness. So it's your ability to shrug off the effects of magic, charms, and mental influence. All right, again, it's a percentage. And then you have fellowship. So this is kind of your charisma, sort of, but it's your social skills, appearance, ability to empathize, sympathize, and generally get on with people. Okay, so those are your, essentially your attributes for this particular game. Talks about a little bit about zero level characteristics. A creature with no hands, for example, would have a dex of 0. So that's how that's explained. And then you have a profile. So this is how all these characteristics are going to be listed across the board here. And it gives you what the highest maximum is for like an average creature of each race. Okay. And then, excuse me, I got just a little bit of like some allergies today. So, again, apologies if my voice sounds a little bit different, and I do have to keep clearing my throat, and I apologize for that. Okay, so then it talks about creating your character profile, And you've got your character race, which is, in this case, man, which is human, elf, dwarf, and halfling. Okay, and then it talks about them and their abilities. So the elves are wood elves, rare, wondrous people living deep within the forests of the old world and rarely making an appearance within human society. And then you have dwarfs. So they use the old school spelling as opposed to dwarves like it is in Dungeons and Dragons. And I think also Tolkien says dwarves, which is maybe where D&D got that from. They use what is most likely the correct version, which is dwarfs. So I remember for years when I used to put dwarves when I was typing in like my word processing program, the program would try to correct it and tell me that that was not a correct word. And then you have halflings. And over here we had humans, which are the most numerous of the 4 races of the old world and the most successful. So that's very much in line with like original D&D and how Gary Gygax imagined the world to be, which is why the non-human races had level limits and they had limitations on what classes that they could operate in. And it was because he wanted humans to be the most prevalent, because the source fiction that he read growing up, the heroes were almost always humans. All right, so then you have age and alignment. And now the alignment here is a 5-point system. And it's very much similar to the Holmes basic set of alignment. So it's basically goes law, good, neutral, evil, and then chaos. So that's kind of the 5-point scale. All right, now the big part of this game is this idea called career classes, and they're grouped into 4 different areas. Now, normally when I do reviews like this of other games, I don't necessarily get too much into the weeds on mechanics, but I'm doing it a little bit more on this one because that was one of the things people said in the comments they wanted to see, was people saying that they're not familiar with this game and they wanted to learn a little bit more about it. And so the mechanics are part of that. But anyway, you have these careers, okay, that are divided into 4 groups: warriors, rangers, rogues, and academics. So that probably sounds pretty similar to what you would see maybe in a D&D game. The rangers one is a little bit off, but then it says they're essentially independent rural characters. And it makes sense once you see what careers fall under that. So academics is going to encompass both religious, like priests, as well as like wizards and things like that, but also non-magic using characters, scholars and things like that. Rogues is pretty obvious. And then warriors, I think, should be pretty obvious. Okay, so you have those different classes, and then it tells you your restrictions to, so weapon skill of at least 30 to be a warrior. Ranger has to have a ballistic skill of at least 30. Rogue has to have an intelligence of at least 30. Interestingly, so it's not dexterity, but intelligence. And then academics have to also have an intelligence of at least 30. I'm sorry, rogue is initiative. That's what that I is. My apologies. Okay, so then it goes through skills, and it talks about how to get your skills and then determining the skills and the mandatory skills. So we're going to get to the skills here, but the skills are divided up into one of those 4 big groups. So the warrior skill chart, your skills are different than if you're a ranger, and then you see what the skills are there. So you see the listing here, and the idea here is that you're going to roll for them, and what you're rolling is affected also by what race you are. So as you see, the dwarf as a warrior can't have luck, also can't have ride, but neither can halflings. They can't have silent move rural or silent move urban. So the dwarves are pretty limited. Elves can't have silent move urban either, but neither can humans. Okay, the only ones that can have silent moves as a warrior would be halflings can have either rural or urban, and elf can have rural. Okay, so you kind of see the differences there. So there's your academic skills. Now they're going to explain what these skills are later on, but this is your table where you're going to roll to see what skills you have. The short version of skills is that they kind of get tied to one of your attributes. But having the skill either means you have it or you don't. There's no gradation of how well you do at performing the skill. You can either do the thing or you can't, but you have to roll usually based on one of your attribute scores. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. All right, then it's going to give you an example of a character. So we have this character, Clem Shirestock, who's a 25-year-old ranger, and he determined his age by rolling randomly, of course. And this is from his age, we can work out that he has D4 plus 1 initial skills. We roll a 2, so Clem has 3 initial skills. As a human, he has no mandatory skills. Consulting the chart for Rangers and rolling a 7, 41, and 77, we find that Clem has already acquired the skills ambidextrous, lightning reflexes, and scale shear surfaces. So those are going to be his starting skills when he starts out before the first adventure happens. And then your career also, in addition to having skills, it's going to have what they call trappings. This is essentially equipment, but it's going to be like little items that you get for taking this career. So then it goes on and tells you warriors are equipped with a suit of sturdy, practical clothing, including a hooded cloak and boots, blah, 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 right? And then rangers have weather-worn and travel-stained clothing. Rogues have begin the game wearing a suit of sturdy, if rather worn clothing, including boots and shoes, and academics have a suit of decent, lightweight clothes. And more stuff than that, but that's just the stuff I'm going over. All right, then you're going to determine your career, and once again, this is, intended to be rolled randomly. So we have this ranger, Clem Shirestock, and we know he's a ranger, so he's going to be rolling on this ranger table to figure out what his career was going to be. And this is sort of the idea of these careers, is that this is what you were doing before you became an adventurer. Okay? And then you get additional skills, and it talks about that. Career description includes additional skills for the character, which are acquired immediately and can be entered on the player's record sheet. So you roll for your initial skills based on your general classification, warrior, ranger, rogue, or academic. But then when you pick your career, or randomly roll your career, you're also going to get additional skills. You're going to get additional trappings on top of the ones that you got over here, which was mostly your clothing, but some other little goodies. And then it's going to tell you if you have magic points, and then it's going to tell you your advance scheme. So that's a big deal with the careers in this book. And the careers are going to take up most of the rest of the section of the player section here. But the career basically is telling you at a certain point, you're going to exit from that career when you earn experience points. So it's kind of like leveling in Dungeons and Dragons. It's much, much slower. It takes forever. And what you get for, quote unquote, leveling is not at the same level of excitement, I guess I would say, of like a D&D game, especially if you're used to playing like 5th edition, where you get a lot of stuff at every level. This is much more, it's more moderate in terms of what you're going to get. But each different career is going to tell you that when you exit from that career, like, can you take another level of that career? Some of them have that. It's almost none of them do, but a few of them do. But usually it's going to say, oh, well, once you've kind of finished this one, you can go, and these are the areas that you can go into. And it'll make more sense when we see it in a second, but that's the career sort of advancement scheme. And then it tells you that each one of these careers has an advanced scheme. Okay, so this particular says, we've already established that Clem Shirestock is to be a ranger, and he rolled on the career chart for rangers and found that his past career was that of an outrider. The section on outriders gives additional skills, trappings, and an advanced scheme. So, and it tells you riders are experienced fighting men employed to reconnoiter the front flanks, traveling parties, blah, blah, blah. So these are the advancements that he can take. So he's already got his movement, weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, all that stuff has started because he is a human ranger, and he knows what those scores are. However, he gets a free advance for his career as an outrider, and he gets to pick one of these things. So he can add 10 percentage points to his weapon skill, ballistic skill, his initiative, his intelligence, or his cool, or he can add +2 wounds, or he can add +10 to, already said his initiative, so he can add +1 to his strength. Those are his choices. He picks one. And in this particular case, it shows you that he starts out like this. This is what he starts out like this. And then you see those repeated down here, his outrider advance scheme. He's going to choose to advance his weapon skill to go from 28% to 38%. Everything else stays the same. So that means that when he's trying to hit somebody, he has to roll 38 or lower on percentile dice. And if he doesn't roll that, if he rolls 39 or higher, he missed. Okay. So there's your summary of your character creation, and then your basic careers. Then you have your alphabetical list of basic careers. Okay, and then you have your list. Now remember, each one of these was tied to one of these 4 main classifications. So there's tables back here. And now, of course, I can't find them. Here we go. Here are the basic career charts for the warriors, rangers, rogues, and academics. So this is a huge part if you are, like, say, a 5th edition fan of Dungeons and Dragons, that is. And these might look familiar to you. So you see the agitator comes with skills, trappings, and career exits. So you can see that the agitator, when they are done with this particular career, can exit as a charlatan, a demagogue, or an outlaw. The alchemist apprentice can exit the career as an alchemist level 1, which is an advanced class, or they could become a bawd, charlatan, counterfeiter, entertainer, bunco artist, grave robber, or prospector. So you see, like, some of them have more than others, but the kind of the implication just from reading this is that the alchemist might not really know what they're doing. So they might just be full of, like, trying to trick people that they know, like, they might not be very good at it. And so, like, one of the career exits is, like, charlatan, which I just think is hilarious. So that's part of this game. Is it is very dark and grim, and the setting does have this kind of weight on it that feels like the forces of chaos at any point could completely take over the entire world. And then to kind of balance that overwhelming sense of dread, there's a lot of, like, little humorous things in here to kind of, like, help keep the game from becoming just completely grim. Okay, so the part that I wanted to talk about in relation to 5th edition is that, now I've heard this, and this came from one of the Facebook groups I belong to. So one of the people is friends with Chris Perkins, who's one of the designers of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And Chris told him, and I haven't verified this because I couldn't find it anywhere else, but I trust this person, that the concept of backgrounds in 5th edition was kind of like came from careers from Warhammer. So you can even see there's a charlatan background right here. There is a charlatan career in here, and it's an advanced career, but it's back here. But, like, the backgrounds of 5th edition D&D, which translates to backgrounds from the 2024 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, have their genesis or their root in these careers that go all the way back to 1986 and a completely different game system. So I thought that was fascinating. And when you read these, look, your skills, your tool proficiencies, and your equipment or your trappings, right? And then it has, like, they have these other little things, like some cool random tables. I love these backgrounds from 5th edition. So I don't play 5e. I played it a few times, but I use ideas from these backgrounds all the time in the game that I run for my daughter, which also means I reference this stuff right here, even though this is completely different mechanically. A lot of the ideas that I get for creating my class concepts that I've been posting on my blog for the BX edition basic D&D, the idea of those, a lot of them came from a combination of these careers from Warhammer, from the backgrounds in 5e, and then from kits from 2nd edition advanced D&D. So I thought people might find that really interesting, that, I know people like to complain a lot about 5th edition D&D, and there's some stuff there, but I think to me, it's less about the system and more about, like, the other stuff that's associated with the game, not necessarily the mechanics, because I think some of the mechanics are quite interesting. So there's just some really, I think, fun careers in here. Some of them sometimes feel like, how would you actually use that? But I think that that's part of the beauty of this, is that, if you're rolling randomly, you kind of get what you get. And as I used to tell my daughter, you don't get upset. So, you get to be creative and figure out, how can I role play that character and make that person an adventurer? So you've got engineers, and you've got entertainers here, and all different kinds of entertainers that you can be. Okay. And then, like a taxman, excise man, you've got a fisherman, footpad, gamekeeper, gambler, grave robber. Really fun ideas. And again, they sort of help to, the type of careers that you can operate in start to help define what kind of setting you're working in. Herbalist, herdsman, hunter, hypnotists, initiate, jailer, labor, marine, mercenary, militiaman, minstrel, mule skinner, kind of fun, noble, outlaw, outrider, peddler, pharmacist. What else do we have? Physician, student, pilot, pit fighter, prospector, protagonist, raconteur. So you saw some of these listed as skills in that sort of proto version of the role-playing game that we looked at as part of the mass combat system. They were called skills, and here they've been developed into this concept called careers. And this is going to be something that's pretty consistent, having these careers across most of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So it's gone up to, I think it's on its 4th edition right now. So the first one lasted a really long time. So the one that I'm holding here goes from 86 until I want to say 2002. And then Green Ronin did the 2nd edition. And then I forget when the 3rd and 4th were published. But the 3rd one kind of went a little far afield as far as the mechanics. And then the 4th one sort of brought it back. So it was more consistent with what was in 1 and 2. But Ratcatcher, Road Warden, Runner, Rustler, Scribe, Seaman, Seer, Servant, Smuggler, Soldier, Squire, Student, Thief, Tollkeeper, Tomb Robber, Trader, Trapper, Troll Slayer. That's a dwarf thing in this. The Slayers for the dwarves. It's a really fun little kind of background thing for them. Tunnel Fighter, Watchman, Wizard's Apprentice, and Woodsman. Okay, and then you've got some nice art here. All right, and so then it gets into skills, and I said like how skills are used, and then it tells you like here's the index to all the skills. Random skills, you can like roll them randomly to kind of figure out what you get, and then it has like your skill descriptions. So just as an example, ambidextrous. Ambidextrous can use both hands equally well and suffer no disadvantageous modifiers for using weapons wrong-handed. They also have a plus 10% modifier for all risk tests based on dexterity to account for their greater adroitness. So a risk test is just like a standard like ability score check in Dungeons and Dragons. So that's based on a D20 against a target number, and then adding your your ability score modifier and your proficiency bonus. And here again, you're rolling low on your percentage. Based on, in that case, you'd be on your dex, but this is saying, oh, well, you get to add plus 10%. So if your dex was whatever, 50%, that means if you're ambidextrous and you're making a dexterity-based risk test, your dex would count as 60 for that. Okay? So these are your skills, and then just kind of, so that's the extent of how they describe how you use these. It's much less detailed and mechanical than it is in say, Dungeons and Dragons, right? So that's all those. Now here's your character sheet. Kind of fun. So there's our friend Clem Shirestock, and we can see he's a ranger. He's got yellow hair and blue eyes. He's 5'11". Okay, and so then it goes through and you see that he's added his plus 10% as his advance as part of being an outrider to his weapon skill. He's got a sword and a knife, crossbow, his armor points, mail shirt, shield, his skills, and then his specialist weapon, he has a lasso. Okay, that's it. That's the whole character sheet. That's all you need to know to play this guy. Oh, sorry. Forgot there's more on the back. His equipment, of course. So movement rate is divided into cautious, standard, and running, which I like. Okay, and then his background, so it tells you where he was born, his parents' occupation, his mother's dead, his father's a bodyguard. And he's got 12 gold crowns to his name, and he's got a horse. All right, so that's it. Of this whole book, that's the player section. You're done. Okay, game master section. All right, so this gets into like basically how to run the game, how to deal with light, how to deal with movement, how to do tests. We just talked about that. Talks about race and alignment. So I'm not going to go, too much into detail on this. It's just your standard game master section, right? So the one thing that this does have that normally wouldn't be found in a typical game master section is it's going to have well, there is an insanity metric. We talked about that before, so very much like Call of Cthulhu. And then this one makes you roll for a disorder, so if you get too many insanity points, you get a disorder. Now, if you've watched my videos before where I talk about my GM advice, which is 90% of that playlist is me talking about practical world applications for how I run the game for my daughter and her friends. So they started when they were about 10 or 11. They're all 15 now. And so, I have what I call a composure metric or mechanic in that game. Instead of insanity, I just call it composure, which is like keeping your cool, just like they have cool in here. And when the players lose composure points, instead of rolling randomly, I let them narrate and tell me, okay, based on what caused you to lose your composure, like you saw something scary or you got hurt really bad or like whatever it was, you tell me what you think your character's going to do now, how your character's going to act in certain situations based on what happened. And I find it much more satisfying than rolling on a random table that had maybe nothing to do with what caused the loss of composure in the first place. It lets my players get involved, and to the point where like sometimes they want to lose composure because they want to like be able to narrate what happens and have like a little quirk to their character. Also, I think it helps prevent, if there's anything on this table here, I mean, these are some real world, things that people suffer from. And this is a game. It doesn't need to be real world. So if somebody, if you're playing with an adult player and they have a drug addiction and they're sober or they're trying to be sober, or like whatever, I think that would be very insensitive to roll on this table and have them have to role play that. That's ridiculous. So let them pick, right? But this game has you roll. There's still great ideas in here. I wouldn't use it that way. Okay, but whatever. I mean, that's just me. I know a lot of people have different thoughts on that kind of thing. Okay, but these are your advanced careers. So it talks about completing your basic career, and then you have these new careers. So these ones are more like your adventures, kind of. I mean, you see right here, there's artisan. I'm not sure I would call that an adventure, but here's your full alchemist, your artillerist, okay, assassin. Some cool stuff in here. Here's that charlatan we were talking about earlier. There's cleric, counterfeinter, demagogue, druidic priest, duelist, explorer. So these get lots of extra stuff versus a basic career. And there are some basic careers that you can take that will let you advance into one of these. Sometimes you have to take 2 or 3 basic careers to kind of get to where you need to be to go into one of these. It just sort of depends on what you rolled. Fence, forger, freelance, highwayman, gunner, giant slayer. So again, we talked about this. The slayers are very much like a dwarf thing, and it's really interesting. Judicial champion, lawyer, merchant, mercenary captain, navigator, outlaw chief, physician, racketeer, sapper, scholar, scout, sea captain, slaver, spy, targeteer, never liked that name, thought it was very awkward, Templar, torturer, witch hunter, and wizards. Okay, and then for the wizards, you have to go to the magic section. Okay, but then, it talks about treasure, like that kind of stuff. Then you get to combat. So the main thing with the combat is we kind of talked about this, right? So basically, the way that you do combat, the short version is you're rolling to see if you hit based on your weapon skill or your ballistic skill. Okay. Then you're going to roll damage, and damage is a D6. Now, there is a table. It doesn't matter what weapon you're using. There's a table in here that allows you to add modifiers, like maybe a -2 to damage for a knife, or maybe a +3 for a two-handed flail. But for the most part, damage is all D6. And if that sounds weird, that's how original D&D damage was. Everything was a D6 until you get to, I think it was Greyhawk Supplement 1, that started to expand the idea of having variable weapon damage, which is also the same time when they changed or started to think about different hit dice for different types of classes. Because before that, every character class was a D6 hit dice and every weapon did D6. So the idea was any character could die with 1 hit. That was sort of kind of the balance, right? But you roll your damage, okay? And then after you do that, you're going to compare to the character's... it says right here, You're going to compare it to the character's toughness. You add your strength to the roll of your weapon damage, and then you're going to deduct the victim's toughness. And then you determine where the blow landed. So then you have to roll on another table to see where exactly did you hit them. Then you have to deduct the value of their armor from the amount of the damage actually caused. And then the damage received is deducted from the target's wounds characteristic. And wounds are going to be like, max like 6, really. I mean, you might get a few more than that, but nothing like D&D hit points where you have hundreds. So characters can very easily die with 1 or 2 hits in this particular game. Usually 1 hit's not going to take you out, but 2 most likely will. And then the effect of any critical hits is resolved in the critical hit chart appropriate to the body area struck. So that's the next part I want to talk about because it's one of people's favorite parts of this game. All right, so let's get to those critical hit tables. And they are divided again by location, so arm. So I'm not going to read all these, but you can just see like the amount of detail in here. So if you roll a 1, your opponent pulls the arm back and avoids serious injury, but drops anything held in that hand in the process. Okay, so that's if you roll a 1 on the critical effect. All the way up to 16, your blow smashes through the arm and into the chest, caving in one side of the rib cage. The arm is completely destroyed, and blood showers yourself and your opponent. Your opponent collapses, dying almost instantly from shock and blood loss. And then again, just as an example, head. A 1. Your opponent ducks as your weapon whistles past the side of the head, saving his life, but losing the tip of one ear, which is torn off. Your opponent may make no attacks on the next round, but may parry. Thereafter, combat proceeds as normal. But if you get a 16, your opponent's head flies off in a random direction, landing 2d6 feet away. And then even like a 15, your blow shatters your opponent's skull. Death is instantaneous. 14, your blow hits the neck, smashing the vertebrae. Your opponent falls to the ground, twitches for a couple seconds, then lays still. So they're all kind of like this. Now, I like, I do like stuff like this because I find it, it's pretty evocative to use descriptions on how a blow lands, other than, oh, you got a natural 20, you hit and did double damage, go to the next person. Like that just pulls you out of the narrative, and it becomes just very mechanical and just becomes a numbers rolling game, which I don't really like. So I created my own critical hit tables for my daughter's game that I thought I was going to use. And then like our first session, one of the players told me that she really doesn't like descriptions of gore. It makes her queasy, and she just didn't want to hear that. And I was like, okay, that's fair, but that means that these tables are basically going to be useless, which is fine. I'm not upset by that at all. So what I eventually came around to is what I was just talking about with my composure table, is when they do something spectacular, like get a critical hit, or when I have critical fumbles in that game too. Neither one of those are part of 1981 basic Dungeons and Dragons, which is the system that I'm running, but I do them anyway because they're fun. So I have critical fumbles, and then I let the players narrate and say, tell me what happened. Did you drop your weapon? Did your bowstring snap? Did you slip and fall? Like whatever it is, right? And mechanically what it means is they can't attack on the next round. So they miss a round if it's a critical fumble. On a critical hit, it's just I do automatic I keep changing how I deal with it. I think what I do is max damage from what their attack was, plus an extra D6. It might be that. It might be double damage. I can't remember. I've changed it a few times. But in any event, the point is I asked them, okay, what happened? What did you do? And like one of the player that didn't like the queasy stuff is the most active during that point. She will get up out of her chair, and she's dancing around, and she's waving an imaginary sword and showing me how she attacked, and I did this, and then he did that, and blah blah blah. And it's hilarious. She really gets into it without being overly graphic, and it works for her and keeps her involved. So I dig that, and I'm not sure that I would have thought that had I not seen. I mean, a lot of games have critical hit tables, right? But these were some of the first ones I'd seen, other than, there's Blackmore Supplement 2 has some critical hit tables, or I guess they're more like hit location tables, which I don't like. I don't like hit location tables because I feel like it's just an added step to slow the game down. Just me. I know some people dig them, but they are not for me. All right, so that's your combat section. So I'm going to breeze through the rest of this. I mean, not breeze through, but I'm going to go relatively quickly But here you have your section on magic. Now, this is where we're going to get our advanced magic careers. So there's your full-on alchemist. Okay, for different levels. There's 1 through 4, and that's how far you can go in any of the magical careers is 4 levels. Then you have your wizard, again, 1 through 4. And then you have your specialty wizards. So nice painting here. Which I really like. That's by our friend John Blanche. Okay, but then you have a demonologist. So again, the availability of these different careers is kind of telling you a little bit about the world. You have your elementalist, you have your illusionist, you have your necromancer. Okay, and then it gets into spells. So, there's your druidic priest. Sorry. So there's not a ton in here, spell wise. I'd say the magic system's probably not as inspiring as some of the rest of the book. I mean, the spells are they're pretty utilitarian. Remove curse, reinforce door, cause animosity, cure light injury. It's not fireball. It's nothing you haven't seen before, right? So I strongly would have preferred maybe having spells that were a little bit more tied to the setting and kind of like a little bit more evocative in their descriptions, even just the names. But, it's serviceable. It's just, I don't think it's necessarily very inspirational. Okay, so there's your magic section. Then your section on religion and belief. And it goes through, like, there's chaos gods and there's outlawed gods and there's the gods of the old world and there's oracles. And then it gets into some of the gods here and describes them. So these are like the cults that you can belong to if you're a priest character. Even if you're not, you're going to follow one of the gods, right? So Ulrich, god of battle, wolves, and winter. People have played Warhammer 40k might recognize that. Okay, so then you have all of these. Cain, Lord of Madness, the Old Faith, non-human deities, and it gets into those. Okay, and then it has the Gods of Chaos, and it says they're going to be in another supplement, the Realms of Chaos, but it does list 3, Khorne, Nurgle, and Malal. Okay, and then the Gods of Law, same thing. All right, then you have your Bestiary. Again, nothing super spectacular here. There's Beastmen, which I do like, so these are sort of like Chaos Mutants, which I dig. I think that's pretty neat. So they divide them up into like humanoid creatures. So these are all your humanoids, and then you have your thing here. You have your Fimir. I don't know how to say that, but you're part human and part demon. So people that hate tieflings, I guess, would hate those. Then you have all the rest of these. Okay, some more cool art here. Lizard men. And there's your humanoid thing. Okay. And then you've got Skaven, which I love. So like rat men that live under the sewers. I think it's such a cool idea. They're not like were-rats. They're different and they're very interesting. And I think they're super cool. Warriors of Chaos. So you have all those. And then you get into like your regular monsters, right? Dragons, basilisks, and hydras and harpies and all that kind of stuff, right? And then your regular animals, kind of regular animals. And then you have your undead, demons, elementals. So that's it. All right, now the world guide. This is probably one of my favorite parts of this, and it's the part that I read the most as a kid. The careers part, and then this, because I was playing Warhammer at the time, so I shifted to playing when I found my new group. We moved. I met a new group of kids. They were playing this instead of D&D, which is the reason that I didn't really ever get into playing D&D 2nd edition. I was playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle at the time. And I ended up picking up this book mainly because I wanted to use it as a resource for creating my own campaign, which is the 3rd edition campaign I've talked about before that I started back in May of 2001. But a lot of my world building was based on ideas from this. So the short version of this, again, it's like Earth. Every nation in here has something that is an analogy of a real Earth culture or like an Earth myth. So there's like an Atlantis kind of thing going on in here. Okay. But all of the cultures are the extreme cliche stereotype, which is fine because you're grabbing onto these ideas that are instantly recognizable and they do it for all of the cultures. So everything is exaggerated to like 100. So, and then the big part of it is that there are these portals or gates that were opened up at the two poles, the North and South Pole of this world, that, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds of the details on this, but essentially they were opened by these gods. The gods disappeared or went away or whatever happened, right? And the portals weren't closed. And so they are slowly over time drawing in the forces of chaos, which is how you get a lot of the creatures in the bestiary in here. A lot of those creatures are essentially things that have been mutated by chaos over millennia. And now they're kind of like their own thing. And the portals aren't closing. So the chaos is constantly pouring into the world, which is why once you figure that out, you know that like there's no way to save this world. You can hold things at bay for a little bit, but as soon as like, you know, you win a battle and then close your gates, they've moved somewhere else. It's not like you completely eradicated them, or there's going to be more showing up, right? It's just never going to stop. And I really liked that. I thought it was really compelling. And I also like, you know, I've talked before, I like the known world from the early D&D stuff, like the Moldvay Basic and the Beckme stuff, the Gazetteers. They even called the known world in here, which I thought was really neat because that's what I called it. I didn't call it Mystera, called it the known world. And I really like the world of Conan the Barbarian. And I've talked about that before, and that is essentially like, you know, a pastiche of like world cultures, like kind of all existing at the same time. Here's that original cover art from the box set from Warhammer. So I liked that this was really based and kind of tied to real Earth cultures, because that's just how I like to play. And I know some people would say that's not very creative, or it's not, you know, it's not fantasy enough, whatever the case may be. But that's kind of how I built the campaign I'm running for my daughter, and they haven't complained yet. So I think, you know, for me, having a world that seems a little bit more grounded in kind of historical analogies then makes the fantastic stuff stand out even more when you add it in, because it creates a disconnect because you're not used to seeing it, as opposed to it just being ever present. And then it's not exciting because you just get tired of seeing it all the time. But that's kind of the big part of this section is the world. You've got the map there, the world guide. And again, I really love it. So it's one of my favorite parts of this book. And then the adventure at the back. I never played through this. It's very, very short. And then you just have the appendix. So that is kind of the somewhat quick look at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So in Dragon Magazine number 124, see the cover price has gone up from $3 to $3.50. So this is from August of 1987. So a little more than 3 years after this one. But our friend Ken Ralston comes back with a review of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So the short version is he likes it. So, which is cool. I'm glad that he liked it. So he has this kind of long introduction where he talks about it's a promising fantasy role-playing game from Games Workshop, the game company that dominates fantasy and science fiction gaming and miniatures markets in Great Britain. And then he talks about, you know, shopping for a fantasy system and like what's out there. So he kind of talks about what's available as far as fantasy currently. And then he dives into the game. So he basically it's a 368-page hardbound. Obviously, remember I mentioned it was hardbound when it first came out. And he goes through character design, everything that we just talked about, right? So not as in as much detail as we did, but character power and advancement, combat systems, magic systems, all that kind of good stuff. So he talks about all of that. And he talks about the finest element of the campaign background is the epic theme of the taint of chaos over the polar ice caps, ancient portals through time and space, artifacts of a decadent old slan race having collapsed, releasing a plague of chaos spores on a host of powerful beings to threaten the old world. The taint of chaos is on the land and festers beneath the crust of civilization. So that's another thing that's kind of part as you play through the different scenarios of this game, and the scenarios are fantastic. There's always like these cults of people, and it's never who you expect, and they're all like trying to help chaos take over, and it's creepy and it's really cool. So he says the thematic tone is dark, The eventual triumph of chaos is inevitable. The tide of chaos may be turned, but it never recedes as far as it's advanced. So he talks about that. He also says the kind of the combination between Call of Cthulhu and D&D. And so I just thought that was interesting that, he, it's been a little bit more time. And so where he originally did not like the role-playing game elements when he was reviewing the mass combat, quote unquote role-playing system, by now, and you can see this is much more detailed. It's much more flavorful. The mechanics have been tightened up, and so he really digs it. Okay, so this actually does well enough that at a certain point, in a few different polls, it makes like lists of like top 10 or top 20, usually top 10, either role-playing games or very specifically fantasy role-playing games of all time. So there was a point in time where I think this was a pretty popular alternative to D&D. And I think part of that was just because it was so different. It not only different mechanically, but different thematically. And that was a huge part of its appeal to a certain type of player that wanted a darker, grittier, grimmer type of world. So that is going to wrap up our look here at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I'd love to know what you guys think about this. Hopefully the folks that asked me to cover this, you got what you wanted. You got your questions answered. But if you didn't, leave your questions in the comments below and I will get back to them as quickly as I can. So I appreciate you leaving comments because it is one way to help the algorithm kind of know that people are interested in the comments. So, and the quicker you can leave a comment after a video is first posted, the better. And the algorithm actually kind of can kind of tell if you're just saying like, oh, if you put like, and I appreciate it. So I'm not saying, but like if your comment is, here's a comment for the algorithm, somehow the algorithm is able to kind of read through that and understand that you're not actually commenting on the video. So, not to say I don't appreciate that. I do appreciate folks that take time to do that. But if there's another way you could word it, I would appreciate it. So I want to thank you so much for sticking through this and for asking me to cover this in the first place. It's fun to, hopefully you found it fun to cover something other than D&D. And this does have ties to D&D as far as the connection between Games Workshop and TSR back in the early days. And then as far as like how the designers of 5th edition D&D were influenced by something all the way back from the mid 80s from when they were kids and playing and, probably playing this and using those careers as inspiration to create the ideas of backgrounds, which I think are, again, kind of a cool concept from 5e. So while you're down there leaving comments to let me know what you thought about the video, make sure to check out places where you can join me on social media. There's all the links in the show notes and links to my blog. And you can, I again want to thank all of the folks who have contributed to the superfans on this. So as I mentioned, I am working on a Patreon, and actually that's something we can talk about. So if you'd be interested in a Patreon, please leave in the comments and tell me what kind of things you'd want me to cover. So I have an idea of what I think I could realistically do on a monthly basis for a Patreon kind of thing, in addition to creating new videos. But if there's something that you'd want or what you think would be interesting, let me know, because you might think of something that I hadn't thought of. So please make sure that you do that. But in the meantime, since I don't have a Patreon, if you have the means and would like to contribute to helping the channel get bigger and better, if you, again, have the means to do so and can contribute to the super fans, which is that little heart with the $sign up by the description of the video, I would super appreciate it. And I just am so overwhelmed with gratitude by the folks that have done so far. So I see all of you, and I try to comment on all of them. I think I have. And these are the names of the folks who have done so far, and I really appreciate you. Especially there's some who have done it like consistently every month since I opened it, or every video since I've opened it. So thanks so much for that. But I also understand if you don't have the means to do so. So no worries, just keep watching, and I hope you enjoyed the content. Please make sure to let me know. And that's going to be it for this video. So please, make sure to come back next time. But in the meantime, happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I actually made my notes earlier today. Normally I try to do them a day ahead of time. I just didn't have time over the weekend. My daughter went back to school today, so we were trying to help her get ready with all her stuff. And anyway, I was making my notes for this video, and we had a little excitement here where I live. So again, I'm in Pasadena in California, and we had a pretty big earthquake as I was making my notes. So it was, depending on which reports you read, it was either a 4.4 or 4.7. So usually they say between 2.5 and 5, I think it's 5.3 or 5.4. You can feel it, but there's like no damage. Well, this one, the epicenter was about 3 miles from where I live. So I live in an old house. It's over 100 years old. And when the earthquake hit, I have friends that told me that they're like, oh, so I was so thankful that it was just like, bang, and it was done. It was like over really quick. And I was like, our house was rolling for like 15 seconds. The house was shaking. The windows were shaking. Stuff fell off the shelves. Fortunately, nothing broke, which is amazing because I have had stuff break before. But it was a pretty big jolt. And so I thought, well, I'm taking my notes. Might be time to pour myself a little beverage. So I have this. This is MICHTER'S Single Barrel Kentucky Straight Rye Whiskey. So, single barrel is exactly what it means. It's not really a true designation, but it's more of a marketing thing. But essentially, every bottle that they make of this particular style, which is their Kentucky Straight Rye, if it has the single barrel US 1 label on it, it means every bottle came from the same barrel, right? So there could be a different bottle that you get with a label that came from a different barrel, but what it means is they're not mixing the rye between the different barrels. So part of the job of the taster, then, the master distiller that's working on this, is to ensure that it's being blended properly within the barrel before it goes into the bottle, to make sure that every bottle is going to taste pretty much the same. So it's a very, very highly developed skill that you have to have in order to be able to kind of like tease out and go like, oh no, that one's too much this or not enough this, or like whatever it is, right? So I like MICHTER'S a lot. It's a little bit on the pricier side, so I don't have it a lot, but I love Manhattans with MICHTER'S. I was fortunate enough, once I was in New York for a business trip, and I was with my best friend who he and I work together sometimes. And so we were visiting some clients, and but in between client visits, we went to a bar and we were just sitting there hanging out. And the MICHTER'S rep came in to call on the owner of the bar to ask if, he would carry their product. And we were sitting there, and because my friend and I have had a glass or two of whiskey over the years, we were able to like intelligently talk with him and ask questions and things, to where he figured out that like we knew what we were talking about. And so he told the bartender, he's like, hey, send a couple of Manhattans over to my friends here. Just use MICHTER'S and, set them up. And we were like, oh, that's so cool. And so, yeah, it was a pretty neat experience. So because of that, when I see this available, I do try to support them from time to time. Plus, I just like it, and I love sipping on it neat. So I love rye whiskey. I've talked about that before. I like the spiciness, which just has some peppery spice in it, but it's also got like this kind of smooth butterscotch finish that I really enjoy. So it is something that, a lot of times I'll put like a drop of water or a cube into like my bourbon. I don't do that with this. I just drink this neat. So cheers. Thanks for watching the video. Yeah, I really like that. And it hit the spot today after that big jolt. So today is August 12th, 2024, and it's also National Vinyl Day. So I thought it would be fun to show, like I went on Discogs and I was like, I'm going to pull out my most expensive vinyl, like not what I paid for, but like how much it's worth now. And some interesting things happened. So the most expensive thing that I own on vinyl is actually a box set by Chet Baker, and I think I've already shown it before. And the reason it's so expensive partly is because it's a box set. I think there's either 4 or 5 albums in there, so that contributes to the value. My second most valuable vinyl record is from the Jazz Dispensary, and it's their Christmas album from like either 2016 or 2017. And it's because I don't think anybody expected them to put out a Christmas themed record. They haven't done it since. And so it was limited quantities, and I got it because I like Christmas music. And so it's just valuable because it's rare. A lot of people didn't pick it up and they've never repressed it. Well, I was like, well, it's August. I'm not going to show a Christmas record. And then my third most valuable one is a Bill Evans album that I also think I've already shown. I'm pretty sure I've shown it on the piano. So on the channel, Bill Evans is a jazz piano player that I really like. I know one of my big supporters of the channel is not a Bill Evans fan. I was just chatting with him about this last week, I think. So this is now my fourth most valuable record, which is the soundtrack to Star Trek The Motion Picture. So regardless of your feelings of the movie, the music is so good. So this is Jerry Goldsmith. And my understanding is the reason that Jerry Goldsmith did the music for this was because either Alexander Courage, who did the theme song for the original Star Trek television show, either didn't give his blessing to use his music, or he was too expensive to hire to bring on, whatever the case may be. So they had to hire a brand new person, which is why there's none of that original series themes in this music. It's all brand new. But Gene Roddenberry liked this so much that the theme song for this movie ended up becoming the theme song for the television show Star Trek The Next Generation. So if you've never seen Star Trek The Motion Picture, you might not realize that. But the music's really good. I love listening to soundtracks, and I've talked before, partly because when I'm doing stuff like making notes or trying to write, I find it very difficult to listen to music with lyrics because I get too caught up in listening to the lyrics. But when I have instrumental music on, whether it's jazz or something like a musical score, like a film score, I can, it just kind of helps me focus. It actually has the opposite effect of lyrical music. It helps me focus more. So the reason that this one is so valuable is because there were only 1,500 copies made. So I picked this up in 2017, and I mean, I didn't pay that much for it at the time. I probably paid, I don't know, $30, $40, whatever it is. It's a 2 LP set, gatefold sleeve. There's a 12-page book that comes along with it here. But again, only 1,500 made. So I guess I just scored because I like Star Trek, and I own this soundtrack on CD, but I wanted it on vinyl, and this popped up on my phone one day, and I was like, yeah, that's cool, I'll get that. And now here it is, 7 years later, the fourth most valuable record in my collection. So if you've never heard the music before, or even if maybe you saw the movie and didn't like the movie, and so you've kind of tried to forget everything about it, I would encourage you to revisit it. There's a lot of really fun music on this. I also really like the follow-up, the Wrath of Khan soundtrack, which was not by Jerry Goldsmith. And I think, again, that was a budget thing. So that movie had a much smaller budget because this movie didn't do that well. So Wrath of Khan was kind of like the test to see, can we do something? And it was so successful, but they had to get a new composer of that. And I want to say it was James Horner, if I remember correctly. It was one of the first things he ever did, which was, and because of that, he was much less expensive than hiring Jerry Goldsmith back. So that's it. That's this particular record. So originally 1979, but then again, this is the 2017 deluxe, gatefold 2 LP edition. So thanks so much for sticking through the bonus content. I always appreciate when you guys do, and I love when people mention the songs and tell me their memories of that. So I appreciate that. Cheers to you for watching the video. If you can watch some of these other ones over here, I would really appreciate it. And I will talk to you next time.